anything?
Yes, I think too much time is spent by newspapers, commentators, and some of these so-called scientists who are supposed to be authorities trying to prove that the Congolese are savage, that they're not fully developed, that they're not able to govern themselves. Most of the things that we see in print usually are designed toward that end. And this is not done actually to prove that they are savage, in as much as it is done to justify what the Western powers are doing in the Congo, or the presence of the Western powers in the Congo, and the presence primarily of the United States. The basic cause of most of the trouble that's in the Congo right now is the intervention of outsiders. The fighting that's going on over the mineral wealth of the Congo and over the strategic position that the Congo represents on the African continent. And in order to justify it, they are doing it at the expense of the Congolese by trying to make it appear that the people are savages. And I think, as one of the gentlemen mentioned earlier, if there are savages in the Congo, then there are worse savages in Mississippi, Alabama, and New York City, and probably some in Washington, D.C., too.
Gentlemen, I think time has come for an exchange rather than individual statements. Anybody want to start? Dr. Griffith.
Seems to me that there is a confusion of degree here that is unfortunate. In the first place, Malcom X's statement, his figures on the Belgian history of the Congo is grossly distorted. I would point out that there were two phases of Belgian occupation of the Congo. The first was the period of King Leopold's rule, which ran from the middle 80s till about 1912, and a second period since then, where the Belgian government took over from King Leopold and actually made a serious attempt, with considerable success, of introducing a type of colonial government which had many qualities to be admired rather than deplored. The figures of casualties in the Congo, the killings, purported killings by the Belgians, I would say two things. In the first place, the pre-colonial era, the slave centuries, exacted a terrific toll in the Congo, and the casualties were tremendous. That is a crime which not only the Europeans and Americans, but also the Africans themselves must share responsibility for. The period after the Belgian government took over the Congo, from 1908, 1912 on, was a period of high administrative development, of performance by a vast number of conscientious and efficient Belgian public servants. The criticism that can be made of the Belgian regime in the Congo after that, from the 1912 period on, is a criticism of lack of understanding on the part of the Belgians that the Congolese people should be expected to participate and should reasonably look toward independence at not some highly remote period, but a period within reasonable range, and that the Belgian government did not, during that intervening period, did not educate, did not give the Congolese an opportunity to develop the talents. And they have just as much natural talent as any other people to develop the talents which would have permitted them to operate successfully this vast country. Now that is an aspect of the situation which should not be overlooked. And I would point out that the Belgian administration of the Congo still, in many respects, gives an example of fine administration which the Congolese themselves and other peoples can also benefit from.
Just one little short.
Yes.
Dr. Griffin, you say I exaggerated the number of deaths?
You said the...
I said he reduced it from 30 million to 15 million. How many million did he...
This was not... Look...
If I say that there were 15 million casualties, and I'm exaggerating it, tell me how many million there were.
In the first place, may I say this?
Sir, tell me how many million casualties there were.
Well, are you going to give me a chance to answer you? In the first place, we have no statistics. We use round figures. We don't even know
Give me some round figures.
Pardon me. We don't even know the number of slaves that were taken out of Africa over the whole period.
Give me an estimate.
The number varies between 10 and 20 million.
You mean
over a period of a couple of hundred years. As far as the Congo is concerned, let me say this: King Leopold.
Give me an estimate of how many million casualties there were under Leopold.
Under Leopold, no one has a figure. I would say that probably through the concessionaires who exploited the natives and who drove them into collecting rubber, there were undoubtedly many thousand casualties, but certainly not 100,000, and certainly not 50,000.
I didn't say. I said that the Mark Twain book pointed out.
Mark Twain is not a historian.
That some of these now that you see calling themselves historians aren't historians.
Well,
Mark Twain points out that the population was reduced from 30 million to 15 million by this man Leopold. Now you say
that is entirely.
You say that I'm exaggerating. How many million was it?
There was no million. Look, Leopold's rubber gatherers exterminated a lot of natives who didn't bring in their quotas of rubber.
How did he exterminate?
It was a shocking thing to have happened, but it does not represent anything like the mass murder that you're describing.
Well, I think we're going to get lost in past history rather than the present events, which are occupying the front pages of the headlines. And I would agree that we have to know something of the background in order to address ourselves to the present. But I'm afraid that the entire program might be devoted to King Leopold instead of the present-day Congo.
But one of the gentlemen said earlier that I think it was Dr. Robinson, I believe, that he saw a seething. What was that? Some very strong feelings that were hostile down beneath the surface in these people, and I think the only way a person can be justified in condemning the Congolese the way that the press is in the process of condemning them right now, they would have to go back in history to find out what it is that made these people act as they do toward these Europeans.
Malcolm, I don't hear anybody asking this question, so I must. I'm curious. I can understand the normal reaction and rage at oppressors when the oppressed get an opportunity to act equally or with superior force. I don't understand, though, how that rage can be effectively shown against nuns, missionaries, etc. That's in the news.
Well, no, certainly it's in the news, but I think it was just as much in the news when the people who were doing the oppressing were cutting off the breasts of black women when they didn't produce their rubber quota, cutting off their hands, cutting off their feet. This is a historic fact. And when you start talking about what the Congolese are doing in retaliation today, they have pictures that are historic fact. This Leopold made it mandatory that when a black man didn't produce a certain quota of rubber, his hand was cut off, his foot was cut off, a black woman's breast was cut off. This is what took place in the Congo. And it took place for a long time. It's easy to gloss all of that over today and make it look like the Belgians went in there with some kind of benevolent intent. But the Congolese are just as humane, just as human, and just as intelligent as anybody else on this planet. And when they reflect this animosity and hostility, I think anyone who goes over there and examines the facts will find out they're justified. In fact, I think that they showed remarkable restraint in the fact that the paratroopers were able to rescue somebody.
Might I add a footnote to this historical item by simply saying so that we can move on from here, Barry, as you say, in the sense that what Malcolm has said is extremely true, and that after all, if Americans really want to know, all they have to do is remember that it was really the reports of Henry M. Stanley who went over there for the Herald Tribune and wrote back about these atrocities, which brought horror to the Western world, that they really forced King Leopold really to give up the Congo, which was his private property. Now, to tie this in with the other element, which of course is the one of racialism, which is very strong here, and this is one reason why you're getting the reaction that you are today, I would go back again to the type of program which once the colonial government took over in Belgium, which really, Dr. Griffin, was in 1910, but the year is not important that you said 1912, is that after they took that government over, they instituted what was known as a philosophy of paternalism. Now, I think that being Americans, it is very easy for us to understand largely what kind of feeling this derives, because this was the standard attitude on the part of white Americans, and particularly in the South, where they ran a paternalistic type of government and a paternalistic type of relationship with Negroes in the South. So it should be easy to emphasize the deep-seated resentment largely which was built up where you largely are oppressed and cannot really, and particularly in the Congo, which was really their own country, but they were not allowed to do anything about it or at least exercise any influence. The other aspect, I think, of the paternalistic framework that you have to remember is that although Belgium really attempted to give a picture to the outside world that it was really a harmonious, democratic sort of structure, this was not true by any means. That as even Dr. Griffin pointed out, that no African was really allowed to rise to a position of some substance, to participate really in the rule of the Congo. And although it's true that the Belgian colonial government did not have any political parties at all or allow any political operation even on the part of the Europeans there, nevertheless, this kind of paternalism really created a very bad situation which Africans were not really in a position at time to do anything about. And this is one reason why there was such a big blow-up when they did get their independence in 1960. The other thing I would really like to point out for all of them to react to also, I think that we really need to bring into focus here two other important postures. One, of course, is the Belgian posture in terms of its operations in the Congo, not only colonial-wise, but even since then, they have been playing, I would say, a rather subversive type of operation have been carrying on there, even since independence, in order to maintain their control and vested interest. Because I think they probably looked across the waters a little bit, or really right next door, and they saw what happened to a tiny European country, meaning the Netherlands. Once it lost Indonesia, it became a really nothing on the international scene. And Belgium realized that without the Congo, Belgium is nothing but a little nation of bourgeois people sitting up there, who will probably have to live on the bounty of support from the United States and other Western countries. So she has manipulated and maneuvered consistently since she granted independence to the Congolese. And this, of course, has created difficulty. Now, of course, the United States got involved in this in various ways. And I think that we really need to assess the American posture if we're really going to try to understand what is going on there today. And before I go on to this, I think, like you indicated, it'd be better if some others reacted to it before I go into greater detail.
Dr. Roberts, I want to bring two factors here. Any use of figures in Africa is absolutely misleading. Nobody knows how many people in Africa now. Nigeria has got the most advanced census taking, and they had to go back and do it 3 times because they weren't satisfied with what they got. Even in these days, I would seriously question these figures of 30 million people being in the Congo. The Liberians used to say that they had 2.5 million people. But when they took aerial surveys, this was reduced down to about 800,000 people. There's a very small population in Africa. There are many reasons for it. The colonial rule in that situation, but there were even bigger problems than those that cut down the population of Africa. If one wants to look at it completely objectively, the lack of a sound diet, for example, that so much of Africa is a place almost uninhabitable for people to live and make a living.
make a good living, even if there were no colonial people standing in the way. So that any use of figures in the past is terribly misleading because there were no census of any kind. These were all absolute guesses. Now, however, Malcolm, I don't care if it was 3 million people or 30 million people. If it's one person who is killed, he's got a right to live. And it's not justifiable, it seems to me, that because I have been hurt that I have to go out and kill somebody else.
I don't think you'll find that I'm...
Well, let me finish now. You've talked a long time now, so you let me finish. Malcolm?
Yes, I would like to point out to my good friend, Dr. Robinson, that since figures are so difficult to get in Africa, as he says, then I don't see how if someone would get so excited when a figure is mentioned that favors the African cause, if they're not going to get just as excited when figures are mentioned that don't favor the African cause. And I wasn't mentioning anything to justify the killing or the death of people. Death bothers me as much as it bothers anybody else. But my contention is that I get the impression that people here in the United States, some Negroes as well as most whites, get more excited over white people who are dying than they have ever shown over black people who are dying. And all I say is that if dying is wrong, if atrocities are wrong, if killing is wrong, then I think people should be just as concerned over the death of the Congolese as over the whites. And as long as it doesn't appear that way to me, then that's when I holler. But I don't want anybody to get the impression that I'm trying to say that death of these people who are there is right. But if it's wrong, then the death of the Congolese is also wrong.
Jerry, I wonder if I might
Dr. Smythe.
pick up with this and bring it into, let us say, contemporary focus, since on your news reports you have been talking consistently and giving reports on what's happening in the Congo. And we might not discuss now something in terms of the things that are dominating the headlines, such as mercenaries and missionaries and rebels and hostages. In saying this, I think that it would be good if we really sort of tried to explore the position and role of mercenaries in the Congo and how they really exacerbate the situation there. Secondly, I think that there ought to be some clarification in terms of the position of missionaries, since some of these people that are being at least killed by the rebels happen to be missionaries, and so that the listening public might understand why sometimes this kind of reaction comes out against these types of individuals. And I know Dr. Robinson particularly has looked into this even as far back as 10 years ago when he was there, and in his modesty he failed to tell you that he really did do a series of 3 or 4 articles dealing with the whole situation.
I think it is unfortunate that we don't call things by their names, and where there is savagery, we don't say that it's savagery. And when there has been senseless killing of the kind of the killing that's taken place in the eastern Congo, where missionaries and doctors and Europeans who, on the whole, were doing something of help to the Congolese people, that we just don't condemn it and call it what it is. And I don't feel that it helps clarity in thinking to equate it with what happened in Mississippi. I think lynchings by the scum that have been carried on in Mississippi over nearly a century should be deplored, but I don't think that it serves any purpose to equate it with the kind of butchery that's been going on in the Congo in this last period. And I feel that we are entirely justified, we speaking as the U.S., we're entirely justified in having this emergency operation to clean out the rebel forces that were already exterminating a lot of missionaries and a lot of people. It isn't as though this happened after the paratroopers were actually on the move. They were exterminating before that happened.
You didn't send any emergency forces to Mississippi.
I think the only misfortune is that we didn't send in the paratroopers about a month earlier and spare several hundred casualties had previously taken place.
Why
now, on one point, I agree with this. Pardon me, will you let me finish, please? On one point, I agree with Malcom X. I think it's tragic and deplorable that Congolese have been killed. I think it is tragic that thousands of Congolese have lost their lives in these troubles. Congolese, a lot of them who were the educated Congolese in these towns where the rebels moved in, they exterminated the only competent Congolese there were. That's part of the tragedy. That is the tragedy of the Congolese people, and it's very real.
Anyone?
Yes, I would.
Mr. Malcolm.
Yes, in my humble opinion, that the United States is getting ready to involve itself in a situation similar to the one that exists for it in Vietnam. It's getting itself bogged down in an area where it will never be able to back out gloriously, in an area where if it stays, it can't stay unless it adds to its own troops or to its own support. And I think that it started out with about 4 different mistakes, all of which the United States had a leading hand in. Shortly after the Congo was given its independence and Patrice Lumumba was elected the rightful prime minister, a great deal of a hassle broke out between him and Kasavubu. And as you recall, at one time there was a question as to who was the rightful head of the Congo. And the United States brought Kasavubu to the United States and supported him in the United Nations and got the United Nations to recognize him and back him as the rightful head. I think a good book that points this out is one by Kwizon Zaki, the Ghanaian ambassador to the UN, a book called Africa Unbound. And he even gives the exact date as to when the UN, through pressure from the United States, supported Kasavubu. The first thing Kasavubu did when he got back to the Congo was to turn Lumumba over to Chombi. I think it was a mistake when the United States backed Kasavubu, number one. And then after Chombi murdered Lumumba, the second mistake, worst mistake that the United States made was when she backed Chombi as the prime minister of the Congo, because no government headed by Chombi will ever bring peace to the Congo, because it can never get sufficient popular support, and it will always have to be propped up by outside support, white support primarily. But it will never get the recognition of other African states, much less the recognition of the Congolese people. And another very serious mistake that the United States involved itself in was when it supplied Chombi with sufficient funds to bring these mercenaries in from South Africa, all of whom are deplored by other African states plus the Congolese people. Another very serious mistake she made was when she gave Chombi planes, United States planes, and then went into Miami, Florida, and got Cuban pilots, anti-Castro, she calls them, anti-Castro Cuban pilots who are American trained, and they're the same as American pilots, and put those pilots in those planes to kill Congolese people. This is what the United States has done. This is the part that she has played, and this is the way the Africans around there look at it. And you never will understand it unless you not only understand it as Americans see it, but you have to understand it as Africans see it. And the Africans look upon those so-called anti-Castro Cuban pilots as American-trained pilots killing Congolese. And then she used her transport planes to help ferry these mercenaries from place to place, and used United States soldiers to operate those planes. And all of this, in my opinion, has made the United States image in the Congo overnight, not only in the Congo, but throughout the African continent, become a very negative image, which probably in the long run won't do this country any good, not only in the Congo, but won't do it any good in any African country, even in the countries where she now is head of the so-called good.
And those were a couple of radio programs, one panel, the one we just heard, a panel with Dr. James H. Robinson, Dr. Sanford Griffith, Dr. Hugh H. Smith, and Malcom X, discussing the Congo course, the Congo now is headed up by Mobutu, who was part of that whole process that happened back in 1960 when, after Patrice Lumumba was ousted, matter of fact, no sooner had the declaration of the Congo's independence been made, that the Aryan press, this is according to a book called Garvey, Lumumba, and Malcolm, Black and Nationalist Separatists, after they got their independence, the Aryan press began headlining news of large-scale unrest and the outbreak of tribal warfare, and such news became increasingly widespread. The Belgian government announced its intention of using its troops, which actually had never left the Congo, to ensure the safety of the white settlers who were there. And at the same time, this is still according to the book Garvey, Lumumba, and Malcolm, it says unscrupulous, power-hungry hirelings of Aryan domination, such as Shombe, Kulanji, Monongo, Mobutu, and Kasavubu, were busy plotting to keep the Congo firmly in the hands of its Aryan masters. And the book goes on to say the entire black world watched as the low-down, despicable creatures headed by Chombe of Katanga announced on July 11th the succession of the cobalt and uranium-charged Katanga province, which is why we might know today why the Congo is still being controlled with Mobutu. And then at that time, Lumumba asked for UN troops to come in and to his aid to kick out the Belgian troops. On July 12th, 25,000 UN troops were dispatched to the Congo, but the book says Lumumba had walked right into a trap. First evidence of this was reflected in the political racial composition of the UN forces. The backbone of the UN forces was provided by Scandinavians, Canadian and Irish troops, and African troops were for the most part drawn from countries entirely subjected to Aryan control and domination. 25,000 UN troops were under predominantly white high military command. And the events that followed ended up in the murder of Patrice Lumumba and the installation of Mobutu, who the United States government now backs. It's 11:30 a.m. This is KPFK Los Angeles, a tribute to Malcolm X, The Deceivers and the Deceived. Coming up next, a reading by Jan Robinson from the autobiography of Malcolm X. Stay tuned.
You have to be careful, very careful, introducing the truth to the black man who has never previously heard the truth about himself, his own kind, and the white man. My brother Reginald had told me that all Muslims experience this in their recruiting for Mr. Muhammad. The black brother is so brainwashed that he may even be repelled when he first hears the truth. Reginald advised that the truth had to be dropped only a little bit at a time, and you had to wait a while to let it sink in before advancing to the next step. Yesterday, I spoke in London, and both ways on the plane across the Atlantic, I was studying a document about how the United Nations proposes to ensure the human rights of the oppressed minorities of the world. The American black man is the world's most shameful case of minority oppression. What makes the black man think of himself as only an internal United States issue is just a catchphrase, 2 words, civil rights. How is the black man going to get civil rights before he first wins his human rights? If the American black man will start thinking about his human rights and then start thinking of himself as part of one of the world's greatest people, he will see that he has a case for the United Nations. I can't think of a better case. 400 years of black blood and sweat invested here in America, and the white man still has the black man begging for what every immigrant fresh off the ship can take for granted the minute he walks down the gangplank. In all my years in the streets, I've been looking at the exploitation that for the first time I really saw and understood. Now I watch brothers entwining themselves in the economic clutches of the white man who went home every night with another bag of the money drained out of the ghetto. I saw that the money, instead of helping the black man, was going to help enrich these white merchants who usually lived in an exclusive area where a black man had better not get caught unless he worked for somebody white. I mentioned, you will remember, how in a big city a sizable organization can remain practically unknown unless something happens that brings it to the general public's attention. Well, certainly no one in the Nation of Islam had any anticipation of the kind of thing that would happen in Harlem one night. Two white policemen breaking up a street scuffle between some Negroes ordered other Negro passers-by to move on. Of these bystanders, two happened to be Muslim brother Johnson Hinton and another brother of Temple 7. They didn't scatter and run the way the white cops wanted. Brother Hinton was attacked with nightsticks. His scalp was split open, and a police car came, and he was taken to a nearby precinct. The second brother telephoned our restaurant, and with some phone calls, in less than half an hour, about 50 of Temple 7's men of Fruit of Islam were standing in ranks formation outside the police precinct house. Other Negroes, curious, came running and gathered in excitement behind the Muslims. The police coming to the station house front door and looking out the windows couldn't believe what they saw. I went in as the minister of Temple 7 and demanded to see our brother. The police first said he wasn't there. Then they admitted he was, but said I couldn't see him. I said that until he was seen and we were sure he received proper medical attention, the Muslims would remain where they were. They were nervous and scared of the gathering crowd outside. Then I saw Brother Hinton. It was all I could do to contain myself. He was only semi-conscious. Blood had bathed his head and face and shoulders. I hope I never again have to withstand seeing another case of sheer police brutality like that. I told the lieutenant in charge, that man belongs in the hospital. They called an ambulance. When it came and Brother Hinton was taken to Harlem Hospital, we Muslims followed in loose formation for about 15 blocks along Lenox Avenue, probably the busiest thoroughfare in Harlem. Negroes who never had seen anything like this were coming out of stores and restaurants and bars and enlarging the crowd following us. The crowd was big and angry. Behind the Muslims in front of Harlem Hospital, Harlem's black people were long since sick and tired of police brutality, and they had never seen any organization of black men take a firm stand as we were. A high police official came up to me saying, "Get these people out of here." I told him that our brothers were standing peacefully, disciplined perfectly, and harming no one. He told me those others behind them weren't disciplined. I politely told him those others were his problem. When the doctors assured us that Brother Hinton was receiving the best of care, I gave the order and the Muslims slipped away. The other Negroes' mood was ugly, but they dispersed also when we left. We wouldn't learn until later that a steel plate would have to be put into Brother Hinton's skull. After that operation, the Nation of Islam helped him to sue. A jury awarded him over $70,000, the largest police brutality judgment that New York City has ever paid. For New York City's millions of readers of the downtown papers, it was, at that time, another one of those periodic racial unrest in Harlem stories. It was not played up because of what had happened. But the police department, to be sure, pulled out and carefully studied the files of the Nation of Islam and appraised us with new eyes. Most important, in Harlem, the world's most heavily populated black ghetto, the Amsterdam News made the story headline news. And for the first time, the black man, woman, and child in the streets was discussing those Muslims. Before very long, radio and television people began asking me to defend our Nation of Islam in panel discussions and debates. I was to be confronted by hand-picked scholars, both white and some of those PhD house and yard Negroes who had been attacking us. Every day, I was more incensed with the general misrepresentation and distortion of Mr. Muhammad's teaching. I truly think that not once did it cross my mind that previously I had ever been inside a radio or television station, let alone face a microphone to audiences of millions of people. Prison debating had been my only experience speaking to anyone but Muslims. From the old hustling days, I knew that there were tricks to everything. In the prison debating, I had learned tricks to upset my opponents, to catch them where they didn't expect to be caught. I knew there were bound to be tricks. I didn't know anything about it, arguing on the air. I knew that if I closely studied what the others did, I could learn things in a hurry to help me to defend Mr. Muhammad and his teachings. I walked into those studios. The devils and black PhDs, puppets would be acting so friendly and integrated with each other, laughing and calling each other by first names and all that. It was such a big lie, it made me sick in my stomach. They would even be trying to act friendly toward me, we all knowing that they had asked me there to try and beat out my brains. They would offer me coffee. I would tell them no thanks, to please just tell me where I was supposed to sit. Sometimes that the microphone sat on the table before you, at other times the smaller cylindrical microphone was hung on a cord around your neck. From the start, I liked those microphones better. I didn't have to keep constantly aware of my distance from a microphone on a table. The program host would start with something of a dice-loaded, non-religious introduction of me. It would be something like, and we have with us today the fiery, angry chief of Malcom X of the New York Muslims. I made up my own introduction. At home or driving my car, I practiced until I could interrupt a radio or television host and introduce myself. Integration is called assimilation if white ethnic groups alone are involved. It's fought against tooth and nail by those who want their heritage preserved. Look at how the Irish threw the English out of Ireland. The Irish knew the English would engulf them. Look at the French Canadians fanatically fighting to keep their identity. In fact, history's most tragic result of a mixed, therefore diluted and weakened ethnic identity has been experienced by a white ethnic group, the Jew in Germany. He had made greater contributions to Germany than Germans themselves had. Jews had won over half of Germany's Nobel Prizes. Every culture in Germany was led by the Jew. He published the greatest newspaper. Jews were the greatest artists, the greatest poets, composers, stage directors. But those Jews made a fatal mistake, assimilating. Their self-brainwashing had been so complete that not long after, in the gas chambers, a lot of them were still gasping, "It can't be true." The Jews never will forget that lesson. Jewish intelligent eyes watch every neo-Nazi organization. Right after the war, the Jews, Haganah, meditating bodies stepped up the long-time negotiations with the British. And this time, the Stern Gang was shooting the British. And this time, the British acquiesced and helped them to wrest Palestine away from the Arabs, the rightful owners, and then the Jews set up Israel, their own country. The one thing that every race of man in the world respects and understands. Not long ago, the black man in America was fed a dose of another form of weakening, lulling, and diluting effects of the so-called integration. It was that farce on Washington, I call it. The idea of a mass of blacks marching on Washington was originally the brainchild of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, A. Philip Randolph. For 20 or more years, the March on Washington idea had floated around among Negroes, and spontaneously, suddenly now, the idea caught on. Overall, rural Southern Negroes, small-town Negroes, Northern ghetto Negroes, even thousands of previously Uncle Tom Negroes began talking March. Nothing since Joe Louis has so coalesced the masses of Negroes. Groups of Negroes were talking of getting to Washington any way they could, in rickety old cars, on buses, hitchhiking, walking, even if they had to. They envisioned thousands of black brothers converging together upon Washington to lie down in the streets, on airport runways, on government lawns, demanding of the Congress and the White House some concrete civil rights action. This was a national bitterness, militant, unorganized, and leaderless. Predominantly, it was young Negroes defiant of whatever might be the consequences, sick and tired of the black man's neck under the white man's heel. The white man had plenty of good reasons for nervous worry. The right spark, some unpredictable emotional chemistry, could set off a black uprising. The government knew that thousands of milling, angry blacks not only could completely disrupt Washington, they could erupt in Washington. The White House speedily invited in the major civil rights Negro leaders. They were asked to stop the planned march. They truthfully said they hadn't begun it. They had no control over it. The idea was national, spontaneous, unorganized, and leaderless. In other words, it was a black power keg. Any student of how integration can weaken the black man's movement was about to observe a master lesson. The White House, with the fanfare of international publicity, approved, endorsed, and welcomed a march on Washington. The big civil rights organization right at this time had been publicly squabbling about donation. The New York Times had broken the story. The NAACP had charged that other agencies' demonstrations, highly publicized, had attracted a major part of their civil rights donations, while the NAACP got left holding the bag, supplying costly bail and legal talent for the other organizations' jail's demonstrators. It was like a movie. The next scene was the Big Six, civil rights Negro leaders meeting in New York City with the white head of a big philanthropic agency. They were told that their money wrangling in public was damaging their image, and a reported $800,000 was donated to a United Civil Rights Leadership Council that was quickly organized by the Big Six. Now, what had instantly achieved black unity? The white man's money. What string was attached to the money? Advice. Not only was there this donation, but another comparable sum was promised for some time later on, after the march, obviously if all went well. The original angry March on Washington was now about to be entirely changed. Massive international publicity projected the Big Six as March on Washington leaders. It was news to those angry grassroots Negroes, steadily adding steam to their march plans. They probably assumed that those now famous leaders were endorsing and joining them. Invited next to join the march were 4 famous white public figures, 1 Catholic, 1 Jew, 1 Protestant, and 1 labor boss. The massive publicity now gently hinted that the Big Ten would supervise the March on Washington's mood and its direction. The 4 white figures began nodding. The word spread fast among so-called liberal Catholics, Jews, Protestants, and laborites. It was democratic to join this black march, and suddenly the previously march-nervous whites began announcing they were going. It was as if electrical current shot through the ranks of bourgeoisie Negroes, the very so-called middle class and upper class who had earlier been deploring the March on Washington, talked by grassroots Negroes, but white people now were going to the march. Why some downtrodden, jobless, hungry Negroes might have gotten trampled, those integration-mad Negroes practically ran over each other trying to find out where to sign up. The Angry Blacks March suddenly had been made chic. Suddenly it had a Kentucky Derby image. For the status seeker, it was a status symbol. Were you there? You can hear that right today. It had become an outing, a picnic. The black man in North America was economically sick, and that was evident in one simple fact. As a consumer, he got less than his share, and as a producer, gave least. The black man today shows us the perfect parasite image, the black tick on the delusion he is progressing because he rides on the udder of the fat 3-stomach cow that is white America. For instance, annually, the black man spends over $3 billion for automobiles, but America contains hardly any franchised black automobile dealers. For instance, 40% of the expensive imported Scotch whiskey consumed in America goes down the throats of the status-sick black man. But the only black-owned distilleries are in bathtubs or in the woods somewhere.